The day my wife sent me a text saying she was flying to Cairns for a week with her colleague, I was standing in the garage re-gripping an old putter I hadn't touched in years. My phone buzzed on the workbench. I read the message twice. Then I put the putter down, walked inside, and poured myself a glass of water. I didn't reply, not because I was calm, because I already knew. I'd known for about 3 weeks, actually. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with a text message. It starts the way most things in a long marriage start, quietly, almost invisibly, like a crack in a wall you keep meaning to get looked at. My name isn't important. What matters is that I was 63 years old, recently retired from 31 years as a building certifier with the New South Wales local government, and I had spent the better part of 4 decades believing I was a reasonably good judge of character. Turns out, retirement has a way of giving you too much time to notice things you used to be too busy to see. My wife and I had been married for 38 years. We met in our mid-20s at a barbecue in Wollongong. She'd come with a friend of a friend. I'd been dragged along by my mate, who wanted moral support talking to a girl. We ended up talking to each other instead. She laughed at a joke I made about sausage rolls, and that was more or less that. We got married 2 years later. Had 2 kids, a son who now lives in Brisbane with his partner, and a daughter finishing her 2nd year at university in Melbourne. For most of those 38 years, things were, I want to be honest here, ordinary. Not in a bad way. Ordinary in the way that a well-built house is ordinary. Solid, predictable, reliable. We weren't the couple who held hands at restaurants into our 50s. But we were the couple who showed up. To school events. To each other's parents' funerals. To the hard conversations about money and health and what we wanted our retirement to look like. She had gone back to work part-time about 4 years ago, after our daughter started uni, and the house felt too quiet. She joined a small property management firm in town. Within 18 months she'd moved to full-time. I thought it was good for her. She seemed energized. I told people at dinner parties she'd found her second wind. And I meant it genuinely. The colleague she mentioned in the Cairns text, I'll call him what he was. Her direct supervisor had started coming up in conversation fairly regularly from about 8 months ago. At first it was professional things. He'd restructured the office scheduling. He had a different approach to client communication. He was very organized. I registered these mentions. The way you register weather reports for a city you're not visiting. Politely. Distantly. Then the mentions shifted slightly. He was funny. He had a good eye for property. He'd recommended a podcast she now listened to on her morning walk. I still didn't register much alarm. Friendships form at work. That's normal. What I noticed, though, and this is where the building certifier in me kicked in, that instinct for looking at a structure and sensing what isn't visible was a change in the quality of her presence at home. She wasn't absent exactly. She was there physically. But she had developed this habit of being slightly ahead of herself. Already in the next moment when she was still in this one. Laughing at her phone in a way that she'd pocket quickly. Going to bed earlier than usual. Then lying awake. I noticed. I didn't say anything yet. About 6 weeks before the text message, she told me she was attending a one-day industry conference in Sydney. She left on a Thursday morning and came home Friday afternoon. I had no reason to question it. I didn't. What I did do, and I'm not proud of the method. Only the clarity it gave me was check our joint credit card statement online. She'd forgotten, or perhaps never known, that I received the PDF summaries by email. A hotel in the CBD. 2 nights, and the room charge was not a single occupancy rate. I sat with that information for a long time. I want to be precise about what I felt, because I think it matters. It wasn't rage. It was something older and quieter than rage. It was grief, I think. The specific grief of realizing that a version of your life you believed was real was not entirely real. That some of what you'd been proud of had been constructed on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. I didn't confront her. Not then. I had reasons, and they were practical. I called my solicitor, a woman I'd used for a property matter years ago, and I explained the situation in broad terms. She was direct with me. She told me to document what I had, to avoid confrontation until I understood my legal and financial position, and to not make any large financial moves without speaking to her first. Good advice. I followed it. I also called my son. That was harder. He's 34, steady as a rock, but he's protective of his mother in the way that sons of a certain temperament tend to be. I wasn't sure how he'd take it. He took it better than I expected. He was quiet for a long time after I told him what I'd found. And then he said, "Dad, what do you need?" Not what did she do? Not are you sure? Not maybe there's an explanation. Just, what do you need? I won't forget that. What I needed, it turned out, was to sort out the financial picture before anything else. This is where things became, I suppose the word is complicated. My wife had, over the previous 2 years, taken on a secondary role, advising on small-scale residential investments through a separate ABN she'd registered. I had known about this loosely. She'd mentioned it as a side interest, something she was developing. I hadn't paid close attention because I trusted her, and also because I'd always found property investment documentation genuinely tedious to read. My solicitor, when I began compiling the financial overview, asked me to pull together everything I could find on the ABN activity. What I found, when I sat down and actually read through it properly, was a set of arrangements that raised serious questions. There were clients who had been charged advisory fees for services that, based on her actual licensing status, she may not have been legally authorized to provide in that specific capacity. The licensing requirements in that area are particular. She held a property management license. The advisory role she'd been operating in may have required an additional accreditation that, as far as I and my solicitor could determine, she had never obtained. I'm not going to pretend I understood every implication immediately. I didn't. I spent several evenings reading the relevant New South Wales fair trading guidelines and asking my solicitor increasingly specific questions. What became clear was that there were potentially affected clients who had paid for advice under an assumption of full authorization that may not have been accurate. My solicitor advised me that this was a matter entirely separate from the marriage breakdown, and that I should not become entangled in it personally. She was right. I stepped back from that thread and let it be what it was, something for the relevant authorities and my wife's own legal representation to sort out, which in time is exactly what happened. What I focused on was the marriage. When the Cairns text arrived, flying up Thursday, back next Wednesday, conference with the team, I read it standing in the garage, as I said, and I didn't reply. She called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was cheerful and slightly too detailed. The way messages are when someone is preparing for a version of reality they expect you to accept without question. She mentioned the hotel name. She mentioned a colleague's name that wasn't his. She said she'd call again tomorrow. I called my solicitor from the back veranda after dinner. By that point, the separation paperwork was already substantially drafted. We had agreed on the broad terms. I kept the house. She was entitled to her superannuation and a percentage of the investment portfolio we'd built together, the details of which were still being negotiated. Nothing had been signed, but the shape of it was clear. The next morning, I had the paperwork couriered to her office, marked for her attention, with a cover note I wrote myself. 3 sentences. I told her I was aware of where she actually was and who she was with. I told her the documents inside outlined the terms I was proposing for the separation. I told her I hoped she'd read them carefully and engage her own solicitor promptly. Then I changed the contact number on our joint accounts, called our phone provider, and had her line separated from our family plan, and sent a brief text to her sister, who I've always liked, and who I thought deserved not to be blindsided, letting her know that the marriage was ending and that her sister would need support. Her sister called me within the hour. She was upset, which I expected, and she was also, and this surprised me, not entirely shocked. She said she'd had concerns for a while that she hadn't known how to raise. We had a short conversation. I told her I wasn't angry, and I meant it. Or at least I meant it in the way that someone in shock means things genuinely, but incompletely. My wife flew back 2 days early. I opened the front door when she knocked. I hadn't changed the locks yet. I'd been advised to wait until we'd had at least one direct conversation to avoid unnecessary escalation. She looked tired. She'd been crying, I think, on the flight or before it. She came inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and I made 2 cups of tea because that's what I do in difficult moments, and we sat across from each other in the kitchen where we had sat for 38 years of mornings, and I let her speak first. She said she was sorry. She said it had started as nothing, which is what people say when they mean it started as something they chose not to stop. She said she hadn't meant for it to get this far. She said she still loved me. That one was the hardest to hear. Not because I doubted her, but because I believed her, and it didn't change anything. I told her I wasn't interested in the details of what had happened between her and him. I told her I'd found them myself, and I didn't need a confession to confirm what I already knew. I told her the papers were real, and my decision was made. I told her I wasn't going to spend the next chapter of my life being angry at her, that I was too old for that, and frankly too tired, and I didn't think it would serve either of us. She asked about the ABN matter. I told her that was entirely her problem, and she should speak to a lawyer immediately, which I understood she had already begun to do. She asked about our son. I told her he knew, and that he was her son, and he loved her, and that was between them. She asked if there was anything she could say that would change my mind. I told her there wasn't, not because I said it to be final or cruel, but because it was true. The trust was gone. I had turned that over carefully for 3 weeks, and I knew the answer. A marriage without trust is not a marriage. It's an arrangement. I'd spent 38 years building something I believed was real, and I wasn't willing to rebuild it on foundations I could no longer trust. She left that afternoon. Her sister came and helped her pack some things. I stayed in the back garden while they did it. I pulled some weeds along the fence line that I'd been putting off for weeks. It felt useful. The formal separation took several months to finalize. There were moments of difficulty, disagreements over the investment account. A period where communication went through solicitors entirely, one very uncomfortable phone call about a piece of furniture that had belonged to my mother. But it concluded. Everything concluded. The licensing issue resolved separately, and in a way that I'll simply say had consequences for her professional situation. I'm not going into detail because it's not my story to tell in full, and because I don't carry satisfaction about it. It just happened. A set of choices made over a long period of time producing a set of outcomes. That's usually how it works. What I want to talk about, what I actually find worth saying now, looking back, is the year after. I was 63 years old, newly separated, retired, and alone in a house in the Southern Highlands that had been built for a family. I had thought I knew what I wanted retirement to look like. I did not, it turned out, know what I wanted it to look like alone. The first few months were strange in a specific way, not devastating. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard people describe divorce as a kind of annihilation, and that wasn't my experience. But strange like the quiet after a storm has passed, and you're still waiting for the next sound. I cooked dinner every night for one and found I was actually quite a reasonable cook when there was no one else's preference to accommodate. I walked the dog more than the dog technically needed. I called my son every Sunday. My daughter came home for a long weekend in winter, and we drove down to the coast and ate fish and chips in the car because the wind was too cold to sit outside. And it was one of the better afternoons I'd had in a long time. I took a short course in furniture restoration at the local TAFE. I'd always meant to learn properly. I made a reasonable job of a cedar dining chair and a not very good job of a hall table. But the learning mattered more than the outcome. I'm not telling this to frame myself as someone who handled everything perfectly. I didn't. There were nights in the first 6 months where I sat on the back veranda with a glass of something and let myself feel the full weight of it. 38 years, 2 kids, 1,000 ordinary dinners and school pickups and Saturday mornings, all of it having been not quite what I thought it was. I gave myself those evenings, and then I got up the next morning and made breakfast and continued. Here is what I'd tell a man my age who is facing what I faced. The legal and financial steps matter. Do them properly and do them early. Get a solicitor before you have a conversation. Understand your superannuation position, your property position, your tax position. Do not let sentiment delay the practical, because the practical protects you when the sentiment is gone. Document before you confront. A confrontation can destroy evidence and give the other party time to rearrange things. The facts, properly recorded, speak for themselves. Tell your children the truth, as much as they need to know to support you, without weaponizing them. They have their own relationships with their other parent. Respect that. And perhaps the most important thing, do not carry the identity of a betrayed person longer than it serves you. It can become a kind of residence, a place you live in that stops you from living anywhere else. The betrayal happened. It was real, and it had real consequences. But you are not required to build your remaining years on top of it. I am 64 now. The house is quieter than it used to be, but it's mine in a way it never quite felt before. The furniture restoration hobby has expanded into something resembling a small side project. I've done pieces for a few people in the area. Nothing grand. Just useful. My son and his partner came down last month. We had a Sunday roast and played cards after dinner, and the dog slept on someone's feet for most of the evening. It was entirely ordinary. I found I was grateful for it in a way that I hadn't been capable of being before. That particular gratitude you can only develop once you've understood how fragile ordinary is, and chosen it anyway. There is a version of this story where I am still sitting in that garage, still re-gripping that putter, still waiting for a life I thought I had to come back to me. I chose a different version, not the dramatic version, not the version with a satisfying confrontation or a villain properly punished, just the version where I looked clearly at what was real, made the hard decisions without flinching, and then slowly, quietly rebuilt something that was mine. That, in the end, is all any of us can do. I've thought a lot about the sequence of it all. Not the emotions. I've made my peace with those, but the actual order of events. The choices made, and what followed from them. Because nothing that happened in that kitchen, or in those solicitors' offices, or on that back veranda came from nowhere. It all had a thread running through it, if you're willing to follow it back far enough. My wife made a series of choices over a period of months. Small ones at first, probably. A conversation that went a little too long. A confidence shared that should have stayed at home. Then larger ones. A hotel room. A fabricated story about a conference. A secondary business built on credentials that didn't fully hold up to scrutiny. Each choice made the next one easier and the eventual reckoning harder. That's how these things compound. Not all at once. Gradually. And then suddenly, I made choices too. When I found the credit card statement, I could have confronted her that evening, in a state of shock, and said things I couldn't take back. I didn't. I sat with it. I called a solicitor before I called anyone else. I gave myself the time to understand what I was actually dealing with before I responded to any of it. That discipline, and it was discipline, not coldness, is what protected me. It meant that when the moment came, I wasn't reacting. I was acting. There's a difference. And it matters enormously. My son said something to me early on that I've turned over many times since. He said, "Dad, what do you need? Not what happened, not who's to blame. Just, what do you need?" That question came from a young man who had been raised to think clearly, under pressure, and to lead with practicality rather than drama. I'd like to think his mother and I had something to do with that. Whatever the failures of the marriage, we raised a person capable of steadiness in a hard moment. That counts for something. The solicitor situation, the licensing matter. I want to say something honest about that. I took no satisfaction from it. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's important. When you've spent 38 years with someone, you don't want to see them face professional consequences, even when those consequences are the direct result of their own decisions. What I understood, eventually, is that my absence of satisfaction wasn't weakness. It was maturity. The capacity to say, "This happened. It had consequences, and I am not required to celebrate it." What I've come to believe, and this is not borrowed from anywhere, just worked out slowly over long walks and quiet evenings, is that a life of integrity is not the same as a life without mistakes. It's a life where the mistakes are owned, and where the corrections are made without flinching. I made mistakes in that marriage too. Things I didn't pay attention to. Questions I didn't ask. A comfort I mistook for certainty. I own those. What I refused to do was make the additional mistake of staying somewhere the foundation had cracked past repair. That wasn't courage exactly. It was just honesty. The hard kind, the kind you direct at yourself. If you're 60, or thereabouts, and you're reading the wreckage of something you built over decades, I'd say this: the rebuilding is slower than you expect, and better than you fear. The ordinary things, a Sunday roast, a dog on your feet, a drive to the coast with someone you love, they return. And when they do, you receive them differently, with less entitlement and more gratitude. That shift, I think, is what all of it was for.